South African farmers and labour unions say that the European Union is selling chicken legs, thighs and wings at below cost, effectively dumping them into South Africa and threatening local companies and jobs. EU producers make enough money marketing just chicken breasts in their home market, so their so-called dark meat is essentially sold as a waste product elsewhere. Europe says its farmers are simply more competitive and efficient compared to their peers in South Africa. Now, this argument, however, leaves South Africa.
South Africa has banned poultry imports from countries infected with the avian influenza virus. Kevin Lovell, Chief Executive.
Africa just drew a line and the world felt it. For decades, Europe flooded African markets with cheap poultry, calling it free trade while local farmers collapsed quietly. Then South Africa said no. Overnight, ships were turned away, contracts froze, and an entire trade routine Europe relied on suddenly stopped working. This wasn't about chicken. This was about control. Because when South Africa shut its doors, something unexpected happened. Local farms came back to life, jobs returned to rural towns, prices stabilized, and across Africa, governments started asking a dangerous question. If South Africa can do this, why can't we? Europe felt the shock immediately, not just in exports, but in power. Because this ban exposed a truth many refused to admit. Africa is no longer dependent, desperate, or silent. This is the moment Africa stopped negotiating from weakness and started deciding its own future. The decision did not arrive with spectacle. There were no dramatic speeches or emergency broadcasts. Instead, a brief policy notice circulated through trade offices, shipping companies, and agricultural councils. South Africa was suspending poultry imports from Europe, effective immediately. Across Africa, the reaction was swift but quiet. This was not just a food policy, it was a signal. For years, European poultry had flowed steadily into African markets, priced aggressively, shipped efficiently, and protected by trade frameworks negotiated long before Africa's domestic poultry industry had matured. European exporters treated access as routine, African consumers treated availability as normal, South African producers treated it as an obstacle. Then South Africa drew a line. The ban was justified publicly through standards, biosecurity, and domestic protection, but everyone understood the deeper meaning. This was not about a single shipment or temporary disruption. It was about control. Africa had reached a threshold. South Africa's poultry sector had grown quietly under pressure. Farmers expanded capacity despite competing with heavily subsidized European imports. Processing facilities modernized, cold chain logistics improved, feed production stabilized. The industry no longer resembled its earlier fragile form. Yet imports kept coming. European poultry entered African markets at prices local producers struggled to match. Efficiency was cited, scale was praised, but African farmers pointed to something else: structural advantage. Europe supported its poultry industry with layers of protection invisible at the point of sale: subsidized feed, stabilized energy costs, export incentives disguised as efficiency. Africa competed not against farmers, but against systems. South Africa had tolerated this imbalance for years. Until it didn't. The ban reframed the conversation overnight. European exporters scrambled for clarification, contracts froze, containers waited at ports, legal interpretations circulated. Africa watched closely. This was the first time a major African economy had acted decisively without hedging language. There were no promises of review timelines or soft enforcement. The message was direct. Domestic production came first. For Europe, the shock was not financial alone. It was psychological. Access to African markets had been assumed. Growth projections depended on it. Poultry was a volume business, and Africa absorbed volume. Losing South Africa disrupted routing, pricing, and expectations across the continent. Africa, however, saw something else: leverage. South Africa demonstrated that Africa was no longer obligated to accept imbalance indefinitely. The continent had been told for decades that open markets were essential. Now it was proving that selective closure could be equally strategic. The poultry ban was not framed as anti-Europe, it was framed as pro-Africa. South African officials emphasized food security, rural employment, and industrial development. Poultry was not just protein, it was feed production, veterinary services, transportation, retail, and income. Europe responded cautiously. Public statements stressed cooperation and dialogue. Privately, exporters calculated losses. Poultry that once moved easily now required alternative destinations. Prices softened, margins tightened, the ban exposed dependency Europe had underestimated. African markets had been treated as overflow capacity places to send excess supply. South Africa's decision disrupted that release valve. Africa's poultry producers reacted immediately. Confidence surged, investment plans accelerated, hiring resumed, feed suppliers expanded output. The ban created certainty where there had been constant pressure. Certainty changes behavior. Africa's regional partners took note. Other African countries did not announce bans, but they began reviewing policies. Import quotas were reassessed. Health standards were scrutinized. Domestic support measures gained political momentum. The South African move reframed what was possible. Europe faced a dilemma: challenge the ban and risk broader backlash, or adapt and accept reduced access. Aggressive response risked appearing punitive, silence risked normalization. Africa sensed the hesitation. For decades, African countries had been the cautious ones, worried about retaliation and aid implications. This time, Europe hesitated. The power balance had shifted subtly but decisively. South Africa's poultry industry became a case study. Analysts highlighted production growth, media focused on jobs, consumers debated prices, but availability remained stable. The feared shortages did not materialize. That outcome weakened opposition. Africa began asking a broader question: if poultry could be protected, why not other sectors? Dairy, grains, processed foods. The ban opened a door that had long been considered closed. Europe, meanwhile, began adjusting strategies. Exporters explored new markets, pricing structures shifted, lobbying intensified, but the assumption of automatic African access was gone. South Africa had not burned bridges, it had renegotiated footing. This distinction mattered. Africa did not reject trade, it rejected imbalance. The poultry ban was not isolationism, it was calibration. South Africa framed the policy as temporary but necessary, yet temporary measures often set permanent precedents. Africa understood that the line had been drawn, not in anger, not in protest, in policy. The poultry ban was not an end, it was a beginning. A moment when Africa demonstrated it could choose protection without apology, when South Africa showed that domestic industry deserved priority, when Europe realized that access was no longer guaranteed by history alone. The continent had learned a lesson long taught elsewhere. Markets are open by choice, not obligation, and once that lesson is applied, the rules of engagement change. Africa had drawn the line, the world had noticed. In the weeks that followed the ban, the effects spread beyond poultry crates and shipping schedules. South Africa's decision began altering conversations across ministries, farming cooperatives, and regional trade bodies. What had once been discussed cautiously was now spoken openly. Protection was no longer a taboo word across Southern Africa. Agricultural unions praised the move. They framed it not as defiance but as correction. For years, domestic producers had absorbed losses quietly, told that competition would eventually reward efficiency. The ban suggested a different truth: that survival sometimes required intervention. Investment followed confidence. Banks that had once viewed poultry as risky revised projections. Financing became available for expansion. Hatcheries increased output. Processing plants added shifts. Rural employment rose steadily, not explosively, but visibly. Europe felt the consequences unevenly. Large exporters absorbed losses through diversification. Smaller producers struggled. Poultry that once moved easily into South Africa now faced saturated markets elsewhere. Prices dropped, storage costs increased, political pressure grew, Europe's internal debate intensified. Some argued for negotiation and compromise. Others warned that conceding access would encourage similar actions across Africa. The fear was not poultry alone, it was precedent. Africa understood the fear. That understanding was part of the leverage. The ban had revealed something long suspected but rarely confirmed: Africa's consumer markets mattered more to Europe than Europe's markets mattered to Africa. The asymmetry was not absolute, but it was meaningful. South Africa used that insight carefully. Officials emphasized compliance and standards rather than confrontation. The language remained technical, but the intent was unmistakable. Domestic industry would no longer be sacrificed quietly. Other African countries followed the development closely. In West Africa, poultry imports were reassessed. In East Africa, tariff structures came under review. No coordinated action emerged immediately, but the mental barrier had fallen. Africa had seen it was possible. Europe attempted adaptation. Exporters explored joint ventures within Africa. Proposals surfaced for local processing and shared ownership. The tone shifted from dominance to partnership. Africa received these offers with interest and caution. The power dynamic had changed. Africa no longer negotiated from need, it negotiated from choice. South Africa's poultry sector matured rapidly under the new conditions. Feed efficiency improved, veterinary capacity expanded, quality standards rose to meet domestic demand. The industry was no longer defensive, it was ambitious. Consumers adjusted, prices fluctuated, initially but stabilized as supply chains adapted. Local brands gained recognition. The narrative shifted from protection to pride. Africa watched the cultural shift closely. Economic policy had reshaped perception. Poultry was no longer an imported staple. It was a domestic achievement. Europe's response remained measured but tense. Diplomatic channels stayed open. Trade officials exchanged proposals, but the urgency belonged to Europe. Africa felt no rush. This reversal was significant. For decades, Africa had responded to deadlines set elsewhere. Now, time favored domestic consolidation. The ban also influenced broader trade philosophy. Africa began questioning assumptions inherited from earlier eras. Open markets had delivered access, but not always development. Strategic closure, applied selectively, appeared to deliver both. This realization extended beyond agriculture. Industrial policy gained traction. Resource processing became priority. Value retention replaced export dependence. The poultry ban became symbolic, not because of its scale, but because of its intent. Africa was no longer reacting. It was initiating. Europe adjusted narratives accordingly. Public messaging emphasized mutual respect and sustainable trade. Behind closed doors, strategies shifted to accommodate a more assertive Africa. Some exporters withdrew entirely, others invested locally. The latter found more durable acceptance. Africa rewarded alignment. South Africa did not expand the ban indiscriminately. It monitored outcomes carefully. Data guided adjustments. The goal was not isolation, but equilibrium. That discipline strengthened credibility. Critics predicted retaliation. It did not come. Europe weighed options and chose restraint. The cost of escalation outweighed potential gains. Africa's markets were too important to jeopardize over poultry alone. This restraint reinforced Africa's confidence. The lesson was clear. Firm policy did not invite collapse. It invited recalibration. Across the continent, policymakers internalized the message. Domestic industries required not just encouragement, but protection during maturation. Trade policy was a tool, not a doctrine. South Africa's move entered economic textbooks and policy briefings. It was cited not as defiance, but as assertion. Europe continued exporting to Africa just less automatically and increasingly through partnerships that acknowledged local interests. Africa continued importing just more selectively, and with greater emphasis on domestic capacity, the relationship did not break. It evolved. The poultry ban marked a pivot point. Africa had demonstrated that it could prioritize its own producers without apology or collapse. Europe had learned that access required accommodation. The broader implication extended beyond trade. Africa's willingness to draw lines signaled political maturity. Economic sovereignty was no longer aspirational rhetoric. It was operational. South Africa had taken the first visible step. Others would follow in their own ways, not in unison, not recklessly, but with clarity. The line that had been drawn was not about poultry. It was about agency. And once agency is exercised successfully, it becomes difficult to surrender. Africa had discovered that truth. The world adjusted accordingly.